The empty table. Margaret smoothed the ivory tablecloth one last time, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the centerpiece of white lilies and baby's breath. The dining room had never looked more beautiful. 3 days of preparation had transformed her modest home into something worthy of a magazine spread. Crystal glasses caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows she'd scrubbed until they sparkled. The good china, her mother's wedding set, gleamed against the starched linen. Silver cutlery, polished to perfection, lay arranged with military precision beside each of the 12 place settings. 12. One for each person she'd invited to celebrate her 75th birthday. Her children, grandchildren, their spouses, the family she'd devoted her entire life to building, nurturing, protecting. She checked her watch. 2:47 p.m. The invitation had said 3 p.m. sharp. Just enough time for one final survey of the kitchen. The roast beef sat under foil, perfectly cooked to medium rare, just how David liked it. The Yorkshire puddings rose golden in their tins. Her famous trifle waited in the refrigerator, layers of custard and fruit and cream, assembled with the patience of a woman who had learned that love was measured in small, careful acts. Margaret had been cooking since dawn, her arthritic joints protesting with each stir of the gravy, each fold of the napkins. But she'd pushed through the pain, driven by something deeper than mere celebration. This wasn't just a birthday party. At 75, she understood the fragility of time, how quickly moments could slip away. This gathering was her attempt to capture something precious, to see all her loved ones around one table, to hear their laughter fill her home, to know that everything she'd sacrificed had been worthwhile. The doorbell should ring any moment now. She pictured them arriving in clusters, David with his new wife Sarah, probably bearing flowers and apologetic smiles for running late, Jennifer with her brood of 3, the children racing ahead to hug their grandmother while she scolded them half-heartedly about their muddy shoes. Michael would come last, he always did, but he'd arrive with that charming grin that got him out of trouble since he was 5, carrying an expensive bottle of wine and fulsome apologies. Margaret touched her hair, styled that morning at the salon. She'd chosen her best dress, the navy blue one with tiny pearl buttons that Jennifer had bought her last Christmas, the one Jennifer had said brought out her eyes. She wanted to look worthy of this celebration, worthy of the love she was certain would soon fill every corner of this house. 3 p.m. came and went. At 3:15, she checked her phone. No messages. Perhaps they were carpooling, she reasoned. Traffic could be terrible on Sunday afternoons. By 3:30, the roast beef was beginning to dry out despite the foil. She turned the oven down and tried calling David. Straight to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. What would she say? "Where are you?" seemed too needy, too pathetic. 3:45, the Yorkshire puddings had fallen, their golden peaks collapsing into deflated disappointment. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching the empty driveway as if her gaze alone could conjure the familiar cars she knew by heart. At 4 p.m., she finally heard the sound she'd been waiting for, but it wasn't a car engine or footsteps on the front path. It was her phone, buzzing against the kitchen counter like an angry wasp. "Mom!" David's voice carried that particular note of distracted impatience she knew too well. In the background, she could hear voices, laughter, the clink of glasses. A party. Just not hers. "David, sweetheart, where are you? Everyone should have been here an hour ago." A pause. Too long, too loaded. "Oh God, Mom, I meant to call earlier. Thing is, Sandra's mother decided to throw this impromptu brunch thing at the country club. You know how she is, used to getting her way. She insisted everyone come, and it just seemed easier to go along with it rather than cause a fuss. Family politics, you understand." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. "But it's my birthday, David. My 75th birthday. I know, and we'll make it up to you, I promise. Next weekend, perhaps? We'll take you somewhere lovely for lunch, the whole family." Next weekend? Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, hollow and distant. "Look, I can't really talk now. Sandra's giving me looks. You know how she gets. But we'll speak soon, okay? Love you, Mom." The line went dead. Margaret stood, holding the phone, staring at its blank screen as if it might offer some explanation,
some reprieve from the truth that was slowly crystallizing in her mind. They weren't coming. None of them. Her children, her grandchildren, the people for whom she'd given up dreams, opportunities, pieces of herself, had chosen someone else's party over hers. She sank into a kitchen chair, still clutching the phone. The house felt cavernous around her, every carefully prepared detail now a mockery of her hopes. The beautiful table setting looked like a stage set for a play that had been canceled. The food would spoil, the flowers would wilt, and she would sit here alone, surrounded by the evidence of her own foolish expectations. But the worst part wasn't the empty house, or the wasted food, or even the crushing loneliness. The worst part was the dawning realization that this wasn't an anomaly. This was a pattern. When was the last time any of them had chosen her first? When had their grandmother, their mother, ever been the priority, rather than the afterthought? Margaret thought back through the years, remembering Christmases when she'd cooked for days, only to have her children rush off to other obligations. Birthdays forgotten until the last minute, hastily purchased gifts that showed no thought or knowledge of who she actually was. Phone calls cut short, visits postponed, promises broken with casual indifference. She'd told herself it was natural. They had their own lives, their own families, their own priorities. She'd raised them to be independent, successful, confident. The fact that they no longer needed her should be a source of pride, not sorrow. She'd repeated this mantra years, each time swallowing her disappointment like bitter medicine. But sitting in her kitchen, surrounded by the ruins of her celebration, Margaret finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the truth. Somewhere along the way, she had become invisible to the people she loved most. She had become... Her phone buzzed again, a text message from Jennifer. "So sorry we missed your birthday, Mom. Sandra's mom's brunch went so late. Rain check? Rain check." As if her 75th birthday was a tennis match that could be rescheduled at their convenience. Margaret set the phone down carefully, as if it were made of explosive glass. She walked back to the dining room and stood looking at the table she'd spent 3 days perfecting. 12 place settings for a party of 1. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't been so devastating. She began clearing the table mechanically, her movements precise and controlled. Each plate went back into the china cabinet, each glass returned to its shelf. She folded the napkins with the same care she'd used to arrange them, but now the ritual felt like dismantling her own grave. As she worked, something hardened inside her chest. Not anger exactly. Anger would have been too hot, too immediate. This was colder, more permanent. It was the sensation of doors closing, bridges burning, the snap of strings that had held her puppet dancing to other people's rhythms for too long. In the kitchen, she covered the untouched food with plastic wrap and aluminum foil. Tomorrow she would distribute most of it to neighbors, keeping only what she could eat before it spoiled. Waste had always been her greatest sin, but today she found she didn't care. Let it spoil. Let it rot. Let it serve as a monument to her own stupidity. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside her, a pad of paper in front of her, and a pen in her trembling hand. For the first time in decades, she was writing not a grocery list or a to-do reminder, but something that came from the depths of her heart. Something that would change everything.
My dear family, I spent 3 days preparing for my 75th birthday celebration today. I cleaned, cooked, decorated, and waited. I set 12 places at the table, one for each person I love most in this world. Not one of you came. David called to explain that Sandra's mother's impromptu brunch took precedence. Jennifer texted about a rain check, as if celebrating my life were as optional as a casual coffee date. I have not heard from Michael at all. I want you to know that I am not writing this letter to make you feel guilty, though I suspect you will. I am writing it because I have finally understood something that I should have realized years ago. I have been so busy being available to all of you
that I forgot to require that you be available to me. For decades, I have been the family's reliable foundation, the one who remembered birthdays, organized gatherings, provided free babysitting, offered financial help without being asked to repay it, listened to complaints, celebrated successes, and quietly absorbed every disappointment and casual cruelty you've dealt me. I told myself this was what love looked like. I told myself that a mother's job was to give without expecting anything in return. I was wrong. Love is reciprocal, or it is not love at all. It is mutual respect, consideration, and care. What you have given me in return for my decades of devotion is the assumption that I will always be there, always be understanding, always accept whatever scraps of attention you choose to offer. Today, sitting alone at a table set for 12, I realize that I have been complicit in my own diminishment. I trained you to treat me as optional by never requiring that you treat me as essential. I forgave every slight, excused every absence, rationalized every disappointment until you learned that Margaret would always understand, would never make a fuss, would never have expectations that mattered enough to honor. I am 75 years old. I do not know how many years, months, or days I have left, but I know this. I will not spend them begging for crumbs of affection from people who have decided I am not worthy of their respect. I am going away for a while. Do not try to contact me until you have decided whether you want a relationship with me that involves actual effort, genuine consideration, and mutual respect. When and if you decide you want that relationship, I will be here. If you decide that my absence is preferable to the inconvenience of treating me like someone who matters, then you have made your choice, and I will respect it. I love you all more than my own life. That has always been the problem. Mother. Margaret sealed each letter in a cream-colored envelope, writing each name in her careful cursive script. David, Jennifer, Michael. She would deliver them tomorrow, slipping them through mail slots and under doors like a ghost haunting her own family. But tonight, for the first time in years, she opened a bottle of wine. Good wine, not the cheap stuff she usually bought for cooking. She poured herself a generous glass and raised it to the empty dining room. "Happy birthday, Margaret," she said aloud, her voice echoing in the silence. "Here's to new beginnings." 3 weeks later, the first-class cabin of the British Airways flight to Rome was only half full, leaving Margaret with the rare luxury of space and silence. She'd never flown first class before. It had always seemed an extravagant waste of money that could be better spent on her children's needs, her grandchildren's wants, the endless list of other people's priorities that had governed her financial decisions for decades. But Margaret was done with thrift for the sake of others. She'd sold her late mother's jewelry, pieces she'd been saving for the family, even though none of them had ever shown interest in heirlooms or history. The money would fund this trip and others like it, adventures for a woman who had spent 75 years adventuring in service to everyone but herself. She sipped champagne and watched clouds pass beneath the plane like cotton balls scattered across blue silk. It had been a month since she'd delivered the letters. A month of silence that had initially felt like punishment, but gradually transformed into something else entirely, peace. There had been responses, of course. David had called repeatedly, his voicemails progressing from incredulous, "Mom, you're being ridiculous," to angry, "This emotional manipulation isn't like you," to worried, "Please just call me back so I know you're okay," to something approaching contrition. "Maybe we could talk about this properly?" Jennifer showed up at her door with tears and apologies that felt more like negotiations. What could she do to make this go away? To return things to their comfortable imbalance? Michael had sent a dozen roses with the card that read, "Sorry I'm such a shit son. Call me?" Margaret had responded to none of them. Not out of spite, but out of something more fundamental. She was learning how to say no, how to sit with discomfort, both her own and theirs, without immediately rushing to fix it. How to be alone without being lonely. The silence had given her space to remember who she was before she became a mother, a wife, a caretaker. Margaret had been a teacher once, passionate about literature and young minds. She'd traveled through Europe one magical summer before marriage, sleeping in youth hostels and eating bread and cheese in parks, drunk on freedom and possibility. She'd written poetry, terrible romantic verses that she'd hidden in journals and never shared with anyone. When was the last time she'd written anything that wasn't a shopping list? When had she last read a book that wasn't a cookbook or a how-to guide for better grandparenting? When had she last looked in the mirror and seen Margaret instead of David's mother, Jennifer's mother, Michael's mother? The plane began its descent into Rome as the sun set, behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. She was really doing this. At 75, she was finally choosing herself. Her apartment in Trastevere was tiny but perfect. A third-floor walk-up with ancient wooden shutters and a view of a narrow cobblestone street where laundry hung between buildings like prayer flags. The owner, Signora Benedetti, was a fierce woman in her 80s who spoke no English and seemed to find Margaret's broken Italian charming rather than frustrating. "You are running away?" she asked bluntly on her first morning, appearing at her door with coffee and pastries, as if she could smell loneliness through the walls. "No," Margaret said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I am running toward." Signora Benedetti nodded approvingly. "Bene, is never too late to find yourself again." The days fell into a rhythm unlike anything Margaret had known for decades. She woke when her body wanted to wake, not when alarm clocks or other people's needs demanded it. She wandered the markets, learning to ask for cheese and bread and wine in Italian, delighting in the music of the language rolling off her tongue. She sat in cafes with nothing but a book and her own thoughts for company, watching Romans live their lives with a passion and presence she'd forgotten existed. In the afternoons, she often found herself in churches, not for religious reasons, but for the architecture, the art, the weight of history that made her own troubles seem both insignificant and significant at the same time. She stood before Caravaggio's paintings and felt something awakening in her chest, some long, dormant appreciation for beauty that served no practical purpose except to exist. One evening, sitting at a trattoria near the Pantheon with a plate of pasta and a glass of wine, Margaret pulled out a notebook she'd bought at a street vendor's stall. For the first time in 40 years, she began to write. Not a letter to her ungrateful children or a list of tasks to be completed, but poetry. Terrible, honest, necessary poetry about loneliness and discovery, about the weight of love given without reciprocation, about the terrifying freedom of choosing yourself. I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the edges of other people's stories, keeping their happiness burning while my own light dimmed to nothing. But ghosts can choose to be corporeal. Spirits can decide to inhabit their own skin. At 75, I am learning to be visible to myself. She read the words back and felt tears on her cheeks. Not tears of sadness, but of recognition. This was her voice. This was who she was beneath all the roles and responsibilities she'd worn like heavy costumes for so long. Her phone buzzed. A text from David. "Mom, it's been 6 weeks. Please just let us know you're alive. We're worried." Margaret looked at the message for a long time, then set the phone aside without responding. They were worried now. After decades of taking her for granted, her absence had finally made them notice her presence. But she wasn't ready for their worry. She was still learning how to worry about herself. 2 months in Rome. The Italian lessons were going better than Margaret had expected. Signora Benedetti had introduced her to a small class of expatriate women who met twice a week in the back room of a local bookstore. They were an unlikely group. A British divorcee who'd fled to Rome after her husband left her for his secretary, a German artist whose children thought she had lost her mind, and an American widow who'd scattered her husband's ashes in the Tiber and decided to stay. "We are the invisible women," announced Helga, the German artist, during one of their post-lesson wine sessions. "Too old to be sexual, too independent to be pitied. Our families think we have disappeared, but really, we are just finally appearing."
Margaret understood exactly what she meant. In Rome, she wasn't anyone's mother or grandmother or daughter. She was simply Margaret, a woman with silver hair and laugh lines, someone who tipped well at cafes and always said grazie with genuine warmth. She was becoming real to herself in a way she hadn't been for decades. The letters from home had stopped. The phone calls had dwindled. She supposed her children had decided that if she wanted to have a breakdown at 75, that was her choice. The lack of pursuit should have hurt, but instead it felt like confirmation of everything she'd written in those letters. They missed the services she provided, not the person she was. One afternoon, while sketching the fountain in front of her apartment building, Margaret heard someone call her name. She looked up to see a woman about her own age, well-dressed and familiar in a way that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. "Margaret Wilson? Oh my God, I thought that was you." It was Patricia Henley, a neighbor from home, someone who would have news, opinions, judgments about Margaret's great disappearance. "Patricia," she said carefully, closing her sketchbook, "what a surprise. I'm here with my daughter's family. We heard you'd gone missing." David was beside himself with worry. He even called the police at one point, though they said there was nothing they could do since you're an adult and had clearly chosen to leave. Margaret felt a flash of something, gratification, guilt, at the idea of David worried enough to call the police, but it passed quickly. "I'm not missing. I'm traveling." "But for 3 months, without telling anyone where you were going? Margaret, that's not like you at all." "Maybe it's exactly like me. Maybe you just never knew me well enough to realize it." Patricia looked taken aback. "Your children are frantic. Jennifer cried telling me about it at the grocery store. She said you sent them some awful letters and then just vanished. They think you're having some sort of breakdown." The old Margaret would have felt guilty at this news, would have rushed to reassure everyone that she was fine, would have apologized for worrying them, would have packed her bags immediately to return home and smooth over the disruption her absence had caused. But the new Margaret, or perhaps the original Margaret, finally emerging from decades of suppression, felt something different. Clarity. "Tell me something, Patricia." She leaned forward slightly. "When was the last time any of my children visited me? Not for a favor, not because they needed something, but just to spend time with me." Patricia frowned, clearly searching her memory. Well, I'm sure they... When was the last time any of them remembered my birthday without being reminded, or called just to ask how I was doing, or included me in their plans as something other than free childcare? Margaret, that's not fair. They have busy lives, young families, careers, and I had all of those things too once upon a time, but I never used them as excuses to treat the people I loved as optional. I never made my mother sit alone at a table set for 12 on her 75th birthday because something more interesting came up. Patricia's eyes widened. They did that? They did that. And when I finally told them how much it hurt, their response was to accuse me of emotional manipulation, as if expecting basic consideration from your own children was somehow unreasonable. Margaret stood up, tucking her sketchbook under her arm. "I'm not having a breakdown, Patricia. I'm having a breakthrough. I'm learning how to matter to myself, since apparently I don't matter enough to them to warrant basic respect." She started walking away, then turned back. "When you see them, tell them I'm fine. Tell them I'm learning Italian and writing poetry and eating gelato for breakfast if I want to. Tell them I'm discovering who I am when I'm not bending myself into pretzels trying to earn their love. And tell them that if they ever decide they want a relationship with me that involves actual effort and reciprocity, they know where to find me. But I'm done chasing people who run from me." 4 months in Rome. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under her door while she was out at the market. Margaret's name was written in unfamiliar handwriting on expensive stationery. Inside, she found a note from David's wife, Sandra. "Dear Margaret, I know this will probably come as a surprise, hearing from me. David doesn't know I'm writing.
He'd be furious if he knew, actually. But I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I think you deserve to know the truth. The day of your birthday party, I was the one who talked everyone into going to my mother's brunch instead. David wanted to come to your party first, actually. He even suggested we could do both, but I said that would be rude to my mother, that she'd already planned this whole thing, that we could celebrate with you anytime. I realize now what I did. I realized that I had been doing it for years, actually. Every time there was a choice between your events and my family's events, I pushed for mine. Every time David suggested visiting you or including you in our plans, I found reasons why it would be inconvenient or awkward or just not worth the effort. I told myself I was protecting our nuclear family, making sure we prioritized each other and our kids over extended family obligations. I told myself that understand that they weren't the priority anymore. But reading your letter, the one you sent David, made me realize something terrible. I've been treating you like a threat instead of a gift. I've been so worried about you taking time and attention away from my immediate family that I forgot you are family. And I've been teaching my children that their grandmother is optional, that the woman who raised their father is somehow less important than people they barely know. My own grandmother died when I was 12. I would give anything to have one more day with her, to hear her stories, to learn from her wisdom. And here I've been systematically depriving my children of their living grandmother because I was too selfish and insecure to share David's love. I know I can't fix this by writing one letter. I know I've poisoned the well, maybe irreparably, but I want you to know that I see what I did, and I'm ashamed. If you ever come home, I promise things will be different. I promise I'll encourage David to prioritize you sometimes. I promise I'll bring the kids to see you regularly, not just when we need a babysitter. I promise I'll try to deserve the forgiveness you probably won't give me. I'm sorry, Margaret. I'm so sorry. Sandra. Margaret read the letter 3 times, sitting at her tiny kitchen table with morning light streaming through the windows. Her first emotion was vindication. Finally, someone had acknowledged what she'd known all along. Her invisibility hadn't been accidental or natural. It had been orchestrated. But after the vindication came something more complex. Pain at the years lost, anger at the manipulation, but also a strange sort of relief. She hadn't been paranoid or overly sensitive. Her feelings had been valid. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer with all the other letters she'd received but not answered. She would think about this new information, but not today. Today, she had plans. Margaret had signed up for a cooking class, not because she needed to learn how to cook, but because she wanted to learn how to cook for pleasure rather than duty. The class was held in the kitchen of a small restaurant, and the chef was a woman about Margaret's age who had learned from her grandmother and had been cooking professionally for 40 years. Cooking is love, Chef Isabella announced to the class of 8 middle-aged women. But first, you must love yourself enough to cook for your own happiness. If you are always cooking to please other people, your food will taste like obligation. Cook for your own joy first, and then share that joy with others. Margaret thought about this as she rolled out pasta dough, feeling the texture under her hands, listening to the chef's stories about her grandmother's kitchen in Sicily. When was the last time she'd cooked something simply because she wanted to eat it? When had she last tasted her own food with pleasure, rather than anxiety about whether others would approve? That evening, she made herself a simple meal. Fresh pasta with tomatoes and basil, a salad with good olive oil, a glass of wine that cost more than she used to spend on wine for a week. She ate slowly, tasting everything, grateful for every bite. Her phone buzzed with another text from David, but she didn't read it immediately. Let it wait. Let him wait. She was learning that urgency was often just other people's anxiety dressed up as emergency. Her emergency was learning how to live for herself. 6 months in Rome. The woman looking back at Margaret in the mirror in her tiny bathroom was not the same woman who had left England 6 months ago. The silver hair, once carefully styled to look appropriate for her age, now fell in soft waves around her face. The worry lines were still there, but they seemed softer somehow, less like evidence of constant stress and more like maps of a life fully lived. She had lost weight, not from intentional dieting, but from walking everywhere, eating only when hungry, drinking wine without guilt. But the biggest change was in her eyes. They looked awake in a way they hadn't for years, alert, present, as if someone had finally turned the lights back on inside her head. Margaret was writing every morning now, sitting at a small cafe near her apartment with coffee and a notebook. The terrible poetry had evolved into something less terrible, and then into something that might actually be good. She'd started showing some pieces to Helga, who had a better eye for art than she let on. "You are finding your voice," Helga had said, handing back a poem about invisible women. "But more than that, you are finding your courage. Voice without courage is just noise."
That afternoon, Margaret did something she hadn't done in months. She called home, not to her children, but to her neighbor, Mrs. Fletcher, who had been picking up her mail and checking on her house. "Margaret, dear, where on earth are you? Everyone's been so worried." "I'm in Rome, Mrs. Fletcher. I'm learning Italian and writing poetry and remembering what it feels like to be myself." "Rome? At your age? Isn't that dangerous?" Margaret laughed, surprising herself with the sound. "The most dangerous thing I ever did was forget that my life belongs to me. Rome is the safest I've felt in years." She learned that her house was fine, that her garden had been tended by Mrs. Fletcher's grandson, that David had been by several times looking for clues about where she'd gone. Jennifer had hired a private investigator at one point, though he'd apparently given up when he realized Margaret was using cash and had clearly chosen to disappear. "They're all very sorry," Mrs. Fletcher said carefully. "Whatever happened, they seemed to understand they made a mistake." "Good," Margaret said. "Understanding mistakes is the first step toward not repeating them." That evening, she made a decision that surprised even her. She was going to extend her stay in Rome. The apartment was rented month to month, her visa allowed for longer travel, and she had more money than she'd realized. Money she'd been hoarding for emergencies that never seemed to materialize because she'd always found ways to handle every crisis without dipping into her savings. But more than the practical considerations, she wasn't ready to go back. She was still becoming herself, still shedding decades of conditioning about what she owed other people and what she deserved for herself. She was still learning how to say no, how to choose her own happiness, how to exist without constantly proving her worth through service. Rome had become her laboratory for selfhood, and the experiment was far from complete. 8 months in Rome. The call came at 3 a.m. Rome time. Margaret's phone, which she now kept on silent most hours, vibrated insistently against her nightstand until she woke up. She almost ignored it. She learned to sleep deeply in Rome, uninterrupted by the anxiety that had plagued her sleep for years. But something about the persistence of the vibration made her check. 17 missed calls from David. Her heart clenched with the old familiar fear. Someone was hurt. Someone needed her. Someone was dying. She called back immediately. "Mom? Oh, thank God. Where have you been? I've been calling for hours." "David, what's wrong? Is someone hurt?" "It's Emily." Emily was David's youngest daughter, Margaret's granddaughter. 8 years old, with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin that could make Margaret forget every grievance. 8. She's in the hospital. She had an allergic reaction to something. We're not sure what. They've got her stable now, but it was touch and go for a while. She keeps asking for Nana. Margaret felt the world shift beneath her feet. "Which hospital? I'll catch the first flight." "But Mom, wait." David's voice was strange, thick with something she couldn't identify.
before you come rushing back, I need to say something. I need to say I'm sorry." Margaret sank onto the edge of her bed, phone pressed to her ear. "I've had 8 months to think about what happened. About your birthday, about the letters you sent, and about how we treated you. I kept telling myself you were being dramatic, that you'd get over it and come home and things would go back to normal. But Emily being sick, sitting in this hospital, it made me realize something."
He paused, and she could hear the sounds of the hospital in the background, the beeps and announcements and controlled chaos of crisis. "When I thought she might die, the first person I wanted to call was you. Not Sandra, not my friends, not anyone else. You. Because you're the person who has always been there, who has always known how to make things better, who has always loved us more than we deserved. And I realized that we've been taking that for granted for so long that we forgot it wasn't guaranteed." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling tears on her cheeks. "I read your letter again last week. Really read it, instead of just getting defensive about it. You were right, Mum. We did treat you like you were optional. We did assume you'd always be there no matter how badly we behaved. And we taught our kids to treat you the same way. David." "No, let me finish. Please. I need to say this. Sandra told me she wrote to you months ago. She told me what she did, how she manipulated all of us into prioritizing her family over you. I was furious at first, but then I realized that I let her do it because it was easier than dealing with complicated family dynamics. I let my wife push my mother out of our lives because standing up to her would have been uncomfortable." Margaret wiped her eyes with her free hand. "I'm booking a flight. I'll be there as soon as I can." "Mum, you don't understand. Emily is going to be fine. She's sleeping now, and the doctors say she can probably go home tomorrow. I didn't call because I need you to fix this crisis. I called because I wanted you to know that when the worst thing I could imagine was happening, you were the person I wanted by my side. And I realized that I haven't been the person by your side when you needed me." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, processing this conversation that felt like nothing she'd ever had with her eldest son. "I want to come home," she said finally. "Not because you need me, but because I want to see Emily, because I want to hug you. Because 8 months of learning how to live for myself has taught me that living for yourself doesn't mean living without love. It means refusing to accept love that diminishes you. Does that mean you forgive us?" Margaret looked out her window at the Roman street below, where early morning light was beginning to touch the ancient stones. She thought about forgiveness, about what it meant and what it cost, and what it might make possible. "It means I'm ready to see if we can build something different together, something where love goes both ways, where consideration is mutual, where I matter as much as I make other people matter." "I would like that," David said quietly. "I would like that very much. Then I'll see you soon. Give Emily my love. Tell her Nana is coming home." The return. Margaret's flight landed at Heathrow on a gray October morning that felt like an old friend's embrace. She'd been gone for 8 months and 2 weeks, longer than she'd ever been away from home in her adult life. As she waited for her luggage, she felt a curious mix of anticipation and calm. She was coming home, but not as the same woman who had left. David was waiting for her at arrivals, looking older and more serious than she remembered. When he saw her, his face crumpled with an emotion she hadn't seen from him since he was a child. Pure relief mixed with shame. "Mum," he said, and then he was hugging her. Really hugging her, not the perfunctory squeeze she'd become accustomed to over the years. "I'm so glad you're home." "I'm glad to be home," she said, and meant it. But there was something different in her voice, a steadiness that made him pull back and look at her more carefully. "You look different." "I am different." She smiled at him, and he saw something in her eyes that he'd forgotten had ever been there, a spark of independence, of self-possession. "But I'm still your mother. I'm just not only your mother anymore." The drive to the hospital was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet.
Margaret watched the familiar countryside roll past and felt the strange sensation of seeing it with new eyes. Everything looked smaller somehow, less overwhelming. The problems that seemed insurmountable when she left, the family dynamics, the loneliness, the feeling of being trapped by other people's expectations seemed manageable now, not because they had changed, but because she had. Emily was awake when they arrived, propped up in a hospital bed that made her look impossibly small. When she saw Margaret, her face lit up with joy so pure that it made Margaret's chest tight.
Nana, you came back. Of course I came back, sweetheart. I heard you were sick, and there's nowhere else I'd rather be than right here with you. As Emily chattered about her adventure, because that's how she'd chosen to frame her terrifying allergic reaction, as an adventure, Margaret noticed Sandra hovering in the corner of the room. Their eyes met, and Margaret saw genuine remorse there, along with uncertainty about how to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Sandra, Margaret said simply, "Thank you for your letter." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "I meant every word. I know you did, and I appreciate your honesty. It couldn't have been easy to write. It was the least I could do after everything." Sandra took a shaky breath. "I know I can't undo the damage I've done, but I want you to know that things are going to be different. I've already talked to my mother about boundaries, about not scheduling things that conflict with family events, and I've been teaching the kids about how important you are, not just as a babysitter, but as their grandmother." Margaret nodded. "That means a lot, Sandra, but I need you to understand something. I didn't go to Rome to punish anyone or to make you all feel guilty. I went because I needed to remember who I was, besides being useful to other people. And now that I remember, I can't unknow it." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not going back to the person who says yes to everything, who accommodates everyone else's needs at the expense of my own, who apologizes for having expectations. I'm willing to rebuild our relationships, but they have to be relationships built on mutual respect." Sandra nodded quickly. "Yes, absolutely. Whatever you need." Margaret smiled gently. "It's not about what I need from you, Sandra. It's about what we need from each other. Real relationships require effort from both sides. They require consideration that goes both ways. They require showing up, not just when it's convenient, but when it matters." Over the next few days, as Emily recovered and came home from the hospital, Margaret began to see the evidence of the changes Sandra had promised. David called her every morning, not because he needed something, but just to check in. Jennifer came by with her children, and for the first time in years, it felt like a visit rather than a pit stop. Even Michael, who had always been the most distant of her children, made an effort to spend time with her that didn't involve asking for money or favors. But the real test came 2 weeks after Margaret's return, when Sandra's mother announced she was throwing another impromptu gathering, this one to celebrate her son's promotion. The invitation came on the same day that Margaret had planned a small dinner party to celebrate her own homecoming, something she'd mentioned to David and Sandra the week before. Margaret watched David struggle with the competing invitations, saw the old patterns trying to reassert themselves. Sandra's mother was already upset that they hadn't attended her last few events, Sandra explained apologetically. It would cause family drama if they missed another one. Couldn't Margaret's dinner be postponed? The old Margaret would have immediately agreed, would have apologized for the inconvenience and rescheduled her plans to accommodate everyone else's, would have spent the evening alone, telling herself that being understanding was the same as being loved. But the new Margaret, or rather the recovered Margaret, looked at her son and daughter-in-law steadily and said, "No." The word hung in the air like a small explosion. "I'm sorry, what?" David asked. "No. I won't postpone my dinner party. I've been planning this for a week, I've invited other people, and I've been looking forward to it. If you'd prefer to go to Sandra's brother's party instead, that's your choice. But my plans are not negotiable." Sandra looked stricken. "But my mother will be so upset. And I would be upset if you broke your commitment to me for the second time."
Sandra, I know it's hard to set boundaries with family. I struggled with it for decades. But at some point, you have to decide whose feelings matter more. The person who demands you drop everything for them, or the person who makes reasonable plans and expects you to honor your commitments. David was quiet for a long moment. Then, to Margaret's surprise, he pulled out his phone. "What are you doing?" Sandra asked. "I'm calling your mother to tell her we won't be able to make it to her party because we already have plans." Sandra's eyes widened. "David, you can't—" "Yes, I can. And I should have been doing it all along." He looked at his mother with something approaching pride. "You're right, Mom. Choosing you doesn't mean we don't love Sandra's family. It means we love you enough to honor our commitments to you." The dinner party was small but perfect. David and Sandra came, along with Jennifer and her family, and Mrs. Fletcher from next door, and Helga, who had followed Margaret back from Rome for an extended visit. They ate pasta that Margaret had learned to make in Italian cooking classes, drank wine that she had brought back from a vineyard in Tuscany, and listened to stories about Margaret's adventures that made her sound like a completely different person from the self-effacing woman they'd known before.
"Tell them about the art class, Nana," Emily prompted, snuggled against Margaret's side with the easy affection of a child who had learned that her grandmother was someone worth paying attention to. Margaret laughed. "Oh, that. Well, I decided to take a drawing class in Rome, even though I hadn't picked up a pencil for anything but grocery lists in decades. The instructor was this very serious Italian man who kept telling us that we had to find our artistic truth. I thought it was all nonsense, honestly." "But then what happened?" David asked, genuinely interested in a way that would have been impossible before her departure. "Well, I discovered I actually have a talent for architectural sketching. There's something about the way buildings fit together, the way light falls on stone. I filled 3 sketchbooks just walking around the city. I gestured to a framed drawing on the wall, a beautiful rendering of the Pantheon that she'd completed in her final week in Rome. I never knew I could create something like that." "It's beautiful, Mom," Jennifer said, and there was genuine admiration in her voice. "I had no idea you were artistic." "Neither did I. That was the point of going away. Not to punish anyone, but to find out who I was underneath all the roles I'd been playing for so long." After everyone left, Margaret sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea, looking at the remnants of a successful evening. Dishes to be washed, leftover food to be put away, the pleasant exhaustion that comes from hosting people you love who actually want to be there. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Thank you for tonight, Mom, for the dinner, but mostly for showing us how to do this better. I love you." Another text from Jennifer. "I'm proud of you for going to Rome. I'm proud of you for coming back. I'm proud to be your daughter." And finally, one from Sandra. "I know I have a lot to make up for, but I want you to know that watching you tonight, seeing how happy you are, how confident you've become, made me realize what we almost lost. Thank you for not giving up on us." Margaret smiled as she turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed. Tomorrow, she would start the process of planning her next trip. Maybe Greece this time, or Portugal. Maybe somewhere she could take Emily when she was older, to show her that the world was full of possibilities for women brave enough to claim them. But tonight, she was content to be home to a family that was finally learning how to love her the way she had always loved them, completely, but not at the cost of herself. As she brushed her teeth, Margaret caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror again. The woman looking back was someone she was still getting to know, but someone she liked very much. Someone who had learned that love without self-respect was not love at all. Someone who had discovered that it was never too late to become the person you were meant to be before the world told you to be someone else. Someone who had finally learned that the most radical act of love she could perform was to love herself enough to require that others love her well. At 75, Margaret had come home. Not just to her house, not just to her family, but to herself. And that homecoming, she understood now, was worth every moment of the journey it had taken to find her way there. Epilogue. 1 year later. Margaret's 76th birthday party was nothing like her 75th. For one thing, it was held in the garden behind her house, where she'd spent months creating something beautiful purely for her own pleasure, not because it would impress the neighbors or provide a nice backdrop for family photos, but because she loved the way morning glory vines looked climbing up old wooden trellises. For another, she had planned it herself, according to her own preferences. There were only 8 guests, the people who had proven over the past year that they wanted to be there, not the ones who felt obligated to come. The menu was simple, foods she actually enjoyed eating, not elaborate dishes designed to showcase her domestic skills. The decorations were wildflowers from her garden, arranged in mismatched vases, because she had learned that perfection was often the enemy of joy. But the biggest difference was Margaret herself. She wore a flowing dress in a shade of turquoise that brought out her eyes, a color the old Margaret would have thought too bold for a woman her age. Her hair was shorter now, styled in a way that pleased her rather than one that seemed appropriate. She laughed more easily, spoke her mind more freely, and had developed the radical habit of putting her own needs on equal footing with everyone else's. "I have an announcement," she said, as they sat around the table sharing a lemon cake she'd learned to make in Rome. "I'm going to Greece next month. Crete, specifically. I rented a little house near the sea for 6 weeks." "6 weeks?" David asked, though his tone was curious rather than alarmed. He learned not to panic at his mother's declarations of independence. "6 weeks," she confirmed cheerfully. "I'm taking a painting class, and I want to work on my Greek. Plus, I've never seen the Mediterranean in autumn, and I'm not getting any younger."
"Can I come visit?" Emily asked immediately. "I want to see the place where mythology happened." Margaret's heart swelled with love for this granddaughter who had learned to see her grandmother as someone worth visiting, not just someone who provided services. "I would love that, sweetheart. We'll ask your parents if you can come for a week during your school holidays." "What about Christmas?" Sandra asked, and Margaret heard the question behind the question. "Are you going to be here for us when we need you?" Margaret considered this. The old Margaret would have immediately promised to be home for Christmas regardless of her own plans, would have cut short any trip or adventure to ensure she was available for family obligations. "Christmas is still months away," she said finally. "We'll see how everyone's feeling closer to the time. If you want to plan something together, let's plan it together. But if you're asking whether I'll automatically prioritize your celebrations over my own happiness, then no. Those days are over." David reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Fair enough, Mom. And honestly, I think we're all better off when you're living your own life instead of just facilitating ours." Later, as the sun set and her guests helped clear the table, really helped, not just performed token gestures while she did all the work, Margaret reflected on the year that had passed. It hadn't been easy, learning how to retrain people who had grown comfortable with her self-sacrifice. There had been arguments, hurt feelings, accusations of selfishness from family members who hadn't yet learned the difference between self-care and selfishness. But there had also been revelations. She had discovered that her children were more capable of taking care of themselves than she had given them credit for. That her grandchildren respected her more when she respected herself. That love, when it was mutual and reciprocal, was infinitely more satisfying than love that flowed in only one direction. Most importantly, she had learned that it was possible to love people completely without losing yourself in the process. That setting boundaries was not an act of aggression, but an act of love, both for herself and for the people in her life who needed to learn how to love better. As she stood in her garden after everyone had gone home, watering the plants she'd chosen because they made her happy, Margaret thought about the woman she had been a year ago. That woman was so afraid of being alone that she'd accepted being lonely, so afraid of conflict that she'd chosen resentment, so afraid of seeming selfish that she'd forgotten she had a self worth protecting. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone Margaret liked much better. Someone who could sit comfortably with her own company, who could ask for what she needed, who could say no without guilt and yes without resentment.
Her phone buzzed with a message from Helga, who had returned to Germany but stayed in close touch. "How was the birthday celebration, my dear? I hope you felt properly celebrated." Margaret smiled as she typed back. "I did indeed, but more importantly, I celebrated myself." And that, she thought as she turned off the garden lights and headed inside to plan her trip to Greece, was perhaps the most important lesson of all. At 76, Margaret had finally learned that the person most responsible for celebrating her life was herself, that the love she'd spent decades trying to earn from others was freely available from the only person whose opinion ultimately mattered, the woman in the mirror who had finally learned her own worth. She had been invisible for so long, first to others, then to herself. But invisibility, she had discovered, was a choice, and she was done choosing it. Margaret turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, already dreaming of Mediterranean sunsets and the endless possibilities that awaited a woman who had finally learned how to live for herself.